Okay, welcome back. Our last presenter of the day is somebody many of you already know, Erich Zimmermann. Erich is the Deputy Director for the National Association of Regional Councils. In his other capacity as Director of Transportation Program, he manages NARC's transportation portfolio, which includes advocating Congress and the administration for issues important to us as members. In addition to transportation policy, he also has extensive experience in issues related to the federal budget and appropriations. Erich is a member of the Transportation Research Board's Metropolitan Policy Planning and Processes Committee and serves as a board member on the Consortium for Scenario Planning. Erich, thank you for being with us today, and I will turn this over to you.
Great, thank you, Sally. Thanks to everybody that's on. I, of course, have joined you in person in the past and would love to have done that again this time around. But as we were chatting about before we got started, the new normal of virtual meetings and conferences, backing up to your conference, our conference with our executive directors on starting Monday evening will also be virtual, and unfortunately we anticipate that'll be the case for a little while. So nice to join you, if only virtually, and certainly pleased to be with you all today. So I'm going to go over kind of a wide-ranging set of issues that we have been focused on recently and will continue to focus on here as things continue to progress. Obviously, we're drawing toward the end of a Congress. We have a presidential election, and so that, of course, colors a lot of what is going on in terms of what's still possible to accomplish from Congress's standpoint, what the administration hopes to accomplish. But that doesn't stop us from important work that needs to be done. If not now, then in the next Congress. So I'm going to go over some of those issues and give you a little flavor for what we've been focusing on. So I'm going to take a quick run through transportation reauthorization and where we stand with that. Talk a little bit about the continuing resolution that Congress is considering now, COVID-19 response and recovery, those presidential and congressional elections I just mentioned and sort of what that means, and then talk a little bit about also the census, and then wrap up with a few sort of overarching thoughts, and then leave plenty of time for question and answer. So of course the big issue is the transportation reauthorization. We got off to kind of a gangbuster start with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee last July passing the ATIA bill, America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. That was a 5-year, $287 billion title, but it was only the highway portion of the bill. But we felt good because there was some action actually starting to happen. It was done on a bipartisan basis. There was congressional Democrats and Republicans worked together to get that bill through the EPW committee. But unfortunately, at that point, we saw a stall out on any more progress with that bill. The way that the Senate bill is structured, it requires that EPW marry a bill with the Commerce Committee and the Banking Committee, which does the transit title. The Commerce Committee does the rail title, and they have to put a bill together, not to mention the funding portion, in order to get a complete reauthorization package completed. And we did not see any title come out of Commerce or Banking over the past year and a half. And frankly, I think part of that was driven by the fact that there was never really a lot of enthusiasm that seemed to come out of Senate leadership from Senate Leader McConnell's office. So there was never that strong indication that, hey, we might be headed toward something. There was maybe a little flurry earlier this year, but it was never really seemed to be a serious consideration for the Senate to move forward on a bill. And I think partly as a result of recognizing that the Senate may not be hurtling toward getting a bill done, the House T&I took a very different tact. They passed their bill, the Investing in a New Vision for the Environment and Surface Transportation in America Act, or the Invest in America Act. Much stronger acronym game from the Democrats on this one than the Republicans, I have to say. They passed that bill this past July 2020. That is a 5-year bill also. It's $494 billion, but that's for all of the programs that we think of as part of the reauthorization program. And so they actually were fairly comparable in terms of size. I think the thinking was the Senate bill, if the highway title was about $287 billion, the whole package would have been probably in that $500 billion range. So I don't think that from a funding standpoint they were wildly different, but the process to get to them was certainly different. House T&I passed its bill on a strictly partisan basis, and we'll get into a little bit of why that may have been. And then that bill actually did move on and pass the full House, unlike the Senate proposal, which only passed in committee. It did pass the whole House, but it did so as part of an even broader $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. And I think in some ways that's understandable. It kind of tied into some of the other things the Democrats were doing in that bill. But I think from a expressing of seriousness of intent of actually getting a bill done, I think the writing was already on the wall then that we were not going to get there. There's no way that the Republicans were going to pick up $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill and move that forward in order to move transportation reauthorization forward. So I think the two approaches, I think the Senate approach, Senate EPW approach might have been a little bit more serious in terms of its timing and the ability to potentially have enough time to get a bill done. The House bill, recognizing that wasn't going to happen, sort of responded in a different way. But one thing I did want to point out also that I think is kind of interesting is how important timing is to seeing these bills get passed. As you can see, most of these are the 5 big reauthorization bills that we've seen from the start of the ICE-T program through today. And most of them you can see pass in odd number years because those are the off year. You're not on a congressional election. You're not on a presidential election cycle. The only one that passed as part of in a presidential election year was MAP 21, but that was done as a 2-year bill, and so it was a little bit of a smaller lift to get there. So it wasn't quite as, I think, something that as somebody running for president you might be concerned. Plus it was President Obama running for re-election, a little different matter as well. And the one that I think is kind of interesting in the other direction, Safety Lou passing in August 2005, that's a mere 8 months after that new Congress came into session. But it's important to note there that both the House and the Senate, which were previously held by Republicans, were held by Republicans coming into this Congress as well. Plus the T21 bill had been expired for 2 or 2.5 years before this new bill got done. So a lot of work had already occurred to sort of get us to that point. So I think the timing is really important. We can often sort of get a sense of how serious these discussions are based on when in the 2-year congressional cycle and 4-year presidential cycle we are. And I think this year we just recognized pretty quickly that it got late early this year. You know, if they weren't going to get something done in the first half of the year, it was really hard to see how there was any real chance of making progress toward a final bill. So what we'll be looking for next time around is some action maybe in the second half of 2021, where the Congress is in. They've sort of gotten comfortable. Seats, offices have been moved. All those things have happened. All the committee assignments have been taken care of, and then they can get into the work of legislating. But the earlier they start that, the more time they give themselves on the back end as well. So that's kind of what we'll be tracking as we look at reauthorization next year. So I wanted to run through quickly. I think at last year's conference, I gave a pretty extensive rundown of the Senate bill. I just kind of wanted to contrast the two approaches because some of this will carry into next year's discussion about what a bill is going to look like. So in the House bill, you really had a much more fundamental reconsideration of the relationship between transportation and and society more broadly. And what I mean by that is you can see in the second bullet a lot more focus on climate and greenhouse gas, trying to bring in much more focus on housing, talking a lot about resilience, and then transit, bike ped, safety issues, which are always a big deal in these bills. But then also accessibility, up to and including an actual performance measure that would indicate how accessible or what steps cities and states and MPOs are taking toward making the system accessible in terms of access to jobs and other opportunities. The Senate, for its part, did take some significant steps, especially from the perspective of when considering that it's a Senate bill. There was some focus on climate, which was, I think, kind of surprising. Not something that you see a lot of coming out of the Senate. Quite a bit, to some extent, they focused on resilience, but also things like wildlife crossings and the things that were important to the chairman. But I do think this was a step forward for the Senate, I think, in terms of some of the issues that they were dealing with. But it was nowhere near as sort of fundamental in terms of the changes it would make to the program as the House bill. The House bill also had a pretty significant focus on local funding and projects, including increasing the sub-allocated portion of STBGP. Sorry, that was a mouthful. The Surface Transportation Program provides funding to states, and a portion of that is further provided down to local areas. I know in Indiana, there's a broad agreement about how that funding passes, so it goes, I think, even to a broader array of MPOs. The typical sub-allocation is only to larger MPOs. I think in Indiana, it goes to most of the MPOs, if not all of them. And so what we saw was an increase in the percentage of that program that is divided out to local areas. So that was a really important factor for us. We worked very closely with the Association of MPOs, with the National League of Cities, the Association of Counties, National Association of Counties, National Association of Development Organizations, to make sure that we're continually increasing the percentage of that program that goes to local areas. It's just such an important program for the types of local projects that many of you are working toward. In addition, pretty significant TAP changes that would have fairly significantly increased not only the TAP program, but also the percentage of those funds that are provided to the local level. In the Senate bill, it's more of a state focus. That makes sense. The Senate are statewide elected officials. That is typically where their focus is. There were some small nods to local needs and local projects, but there was no increase, for example, in the SDP sub-allocation percentage that we got in the House bill. So not a shock there, but I think the House bill pretty heavily tried to lean in the local direction and try and bring this program much closer to the local level. The House bill also added some core programs, which I think may not be the best approach in the sense of how funding is divided and how the funding gets out the door, because that also resulted in less formula funding, more funding going out through competitive grant programs. I know for sure that I hear from members all the time, they do better when funding goes out by formula, when it's not a sort of politically driven decision in Washington, but a sort of collectively made decision made at the state and or local and obviously regional level as well. So the Senate bill is focused much more heavily on ensuring as high a degree as possible as formula funding. I think that's generally positive, and also really left the structure of the program largely in place. And that is also true for the planning process and program. The House bill had significant changes to planning, including a whole host of new requirements that MPOs would have been required to meet under the bill on things like greenhouse gases, congestion, and a number of other topic areas. Whereas in the Senate, there really were very few changes to planning requirements. So there's just a pretty wide gap between those two. And then importantly, both of them, as I mentioned, unfunded. We'll talk about that now in terms of, that is obviously a huge factor. The biggest factor of these tends to be, so I'm sorry if there's a little stutter to the audio, they're gonna let me know. I can maybe turn off the webcam if that continues. So the money is always the big question when it comes to the reauthorization of the program. So basically, well, let me go into this part first, and then I'll get into the funding in the next slide. But as you can see here, so basically both of those bills were introduced, got as far as they did, but we have an expiration facing us on September 30th. This program is set to expire gas tax collections are set to expire on September 30th, so something needs to happen in the near term. It's not going to be a long-term reauthorization. So basically what Congress has done as part of its continuing resolution, which will fund the entirety of the government into December, at which point they'll have to figure out what to do with the appropriations bills. It also contains a clean one-year extension of the FAST Act to keep the program operating into next year. So this was an important question, because in order to even extend the program by a year, that would have essentially bankrupted the Highway Trust Fund again, because so much of what it's relying on now are the $70 billion transferred in as part of FAST Act from general funds into the Highway Trust Fund. So in order to get to a year extension, which everybody agreed was the more ideal time frame than something shorter, it require a transfer of funds. It will require a transfer of funds into the trust fund to keep it solvent. And you can see there, there is $10.4 billion going into the highway account, $3.2 billion into the transit account in order to shore up the trust fund and keep it operating for that 1 year that they are extending the program. To put that into a little bit of perspective, in order to keep the trust fund operating, we've had $153.5 billion since 2008, including the $13.6 billion that will have to be transferred in this year to keep it operating. So pretty significant level of transfer. And I think this illustrates why that's happening. You can see the blue lines at the bottom there are gas tax receipts. Of course, this doesn't even take into account some of the changes that will occur as a result of COVID, which are not insignificant. You can see the red line, which is the baseline spending level, what we're spending now. The dashed line was the Invest in America spending levels. So the delta between the red line and the top of those blue lines is the amount each year that the program is short of funding. And so in order to pass a 5-year bill, we need somewhere in the vicinity of another $100 billion, probably more now, in order to keep the program solvent and keep the trust fund operating. So we have a massive challenge ahead of us in order to get this program reauthorized in the near term. So as mentioned, continuing resolution, it's going to fund all aspects of the government. It has passed the House. We're not quite sure when the Senate is going to act, but as mentioned, we do have a pretty significant deadline of September 30th to help ensure that the transportation program continues to operate and the government stays open past that deadline. So September 30th, a big date. They seem set on getting something done before then. So we will not see a government shutdown. We won't see an end to the transportation program, but still a little scary how close they're sort of running up to that deadline. So talk a little bit about COVID response and recovery. As I'm sure folks are acutely aware, the last comprehensive response legislation was the CARES Act, which now passed. It's been more than 6 months since that bill passed. Earlier this year, the House passed another massive bill, a $3.3 trillion HEROES Act. The Senate has been focused on a much smaller number. The White House somewhere sort of in the middle, maybe around the $1.5 trillion mark. And to date, agreement has unfortunately been elusive on this. However, just yesterday, maybe it's been 2 days now, the Dems introduced a pared down package, a $2.2 trillion COVID response package that does include significant funding to help backstop local governments, $436 billion. And then in terms of transportation investments, it has $32 billion that the transit industry has been requesting, $2.4 billion for Amtrak, $28.3 billion for airlines, $13.5 billion for airports, but $0, and I say unfortunately, for state DOTs, because the way that the original House bill was structured, it provided funding and then sub-allocated a portion of that funding for local projects. And so it helped backfill not only state level projects, but would also help backfill local projects. Without that, I'm afraid that there's going to be, and already has been, projects that have to stop or that are reprogrammed for later years. So It's a little disappointing that one of the things that had to get cut as part of the paring down of this package was that support for that specialized support for transportation projects at the state and local level. But importantly, it does, like I said, contain robust funding for local governments, which was missing from the CARES Act. And I'm sure all of you are well aware of the suffering going on at the city level, at the county level, and the need to help out governments at those levels as they continue to deal with the fallout from COVID-19 and what is expected to be an ongoing situation with sort of unknown end time. It is really important that Congress provides some funding to help state and local coffers during this period. So we will see where that goes. It's kind of a last-ditch effort, but it's only mostly dead, as you can see Billy Crystal from Princess Bride saying there. So another factor that is just really important here and sort of colors our thinking and approach to things, we obviously have on the verge of presidential and congressional elections. Whether we have a second Trump term or a first Biden term, we may, we always feel like we're on the precipice of something of an infrastructure package, though, of course, I'm sure folks know the joke, it's always infrastructure week in Washington. But I do think there may be a push to get something along those lines done, whether as part of a COVID package, perhaps as a standalone stimulus, though I think there is some skepticism about that approach or that idea. So we're gonna have to wait to see how that plays out in either case, but I do think the new year will bring some added attention and focus on the need to continue to stimulate the economy. We'll be past the election, so hopefully things will be calmed down a little bit from a politics standpoint, and there can be a little bit more serious conversation about how to proceed on that point. It is expected that the Democrats will retain the House, and so I believe Transportation and Infrastructure Committee leadership will stay the same. Chairman Peter DeFazio and Ranking Member Sam Graves staying in those positions. I think there's more question about who will control the Senate, but what's interesting for our purposes is that either way, whether the GOP holds on to the Senate or the Democrats win the Senate, we're going to see a new EPW chair because the current EPW chair, Mr. Barrasso, is term limited and therefore will not be able to serve if the Republicans hold on to that chamber. Similarly, if the Democrats take over, we would see a new chair there as well. So that's important.
I think we have a question here. This is a good time. Diana Trader asks, there was a rail crossing provision and program in the House Invest Act that we are very much in favor of. Do you foresee that or something like it carrying over into a Senate version?
Yeah, there was a lot of, there was quite a bit of focus on rail crossings, not only within the House package, but also separately. I know that there was some activity that was inspired by the private railroads that were interested in developing some opportunities there, some funding opportunities for fixing up or adding new rail crossings. So I think that is a conversation that is certainly going to continue into next year. So I think the House provisions on that are a good starting point. I think what the private railroads are focused on only adds to that possibility that something pretty significant in that direction is likely to occur whenever they get to reauthorization. I would love to say next year, but whenever that happens. And then the final area where we have been focused and spending some significant energy is on the census, as again, another issue I'm sure many of you or all of you are well aware of. The census was originally supposed to end its count at the end of October. Because Congress did not move some of the regulatory dates or some of the statutorily required dates for posting the results of the census count. The Census Bureau announced it was moving back collection to end at the end of September, tomorrow. Obviously, there's been some court machinations on that, There's been the court ruled that they were not allowed to stop the count on the 30th. So as a result, the administration has announced that the count will now end on October 5th. You know, we have done everything that we can to make the point to, and many other groups as well, but working with our partners. So we've been focused on the census question pretty significantly because of the dramatic impact that the census count and an accurate census count has on how funding is distributed down to the local level, how congressional districts are drawn. Obviously, at the MPO level, it establishes what population the MPOs, you know, what population each MPO has, what their boundaries look like. So this is a really acute and important topic for regional planning entities specifically, because it kind of hits on both sides, both on the funding side and even on the sort of existential, what do our boundaries look like for that our organization is covering. So this is something that we've been pushing as hard as we can on. I think at this point it's probably out of the hands of any group or lobbyist or anything. I think right now it's primarily a court battle. We'll see how that continues to play out. But we'll obviously be focused on this and following this all the way into 2022, which is when the census data is used to draw those MPO boundaries and establish where new MPOs may be created and things like that. So this is obviously a longer term pursuit in that regard, but a very short term consideration in terms of when this count is going to end, and we'll see what the courts have to say about that. Oops. So a few key takeaways. Hopefully you heard some or most of what I've said today, but we are going to have to restart the reauthorization process. There's just no two ways about that. New bills will have to be introduced. The old work goes out the window with the new Congress. But I will say that I do think the positive but here is that a one-year extension really is a decent outcome, in part because of that timing I was talking about. If you only pushed it out 6 months, you can be darn well assured that in 6 months from September 30th, there's no way a transportation reauthorization bill is getting done. It's just too soon into the new Congress, especially if there's a change in a chamber, change in control of a chamber, or a new president. Those are just not, that's just not the right timing. A year into a new Congress, however, we might actually start to see some work toward a bill, and you know, the policy starting to come together at least a little bit more hopeful timeline there for actually getting a bill done. You know, I think quite obviously the elections are going to be a key turning point here, but as I mentioned, there is some change coming regardless. You know, we're going to have a new Senate EPW chair. No matter what, that means a whole new process will have to be initiated there. So, you know, there is change coming no matter what happens here in November. Obviously, as I said, the funding is always the big challenge here. And the but here is that early in a new Congress and early in sort of the 4-year presidential election cycle does tend to be when sort of larger tax extender, maybe even in this case a stimulus bill could happen. And if that happens, then one thing I've heard posited, which seems to have some possibility, is that at that time, when you're already spending trillions of dollars in one form or another, that's when you can take care of the trust fund. You can transfer the funds that are needed, or you can, you know, perhaps, though unlikely, increase the gas tax at that time, but do something to shore up the funding, even though you're not doing the policy until later. But by having the funding in place, you make doing the policy 1,000 times easier. If the money's there to spend, they can come together pretty quickly on the policy to spend it. So that is something definitely to keep an eye out for. We had certainly hoped for that, some action in that direction when the tax bill was passed in this last go around a few years back, and we sort of got left out of that. No changes were made, and I think that at that moment kind of foretold that we weren't going to see a reauthorization bill. So what we need is some action on the funding. If we can get that early in the Congress, then I think the policy will follow, and we might see something happen in the next couple of years. And then the final key takeaway, and this is more about you than it is about me, the work never ends. I know you all know that. The work in Washington never ends because they never seem to get very much done. And so it's this endless cycle of you know, starting and stopping and starting and stopping. And there's really no but on this one. The work just simply never ends. On your side at the local level, you know, we feel like on the congressional side, there's still plenty of work that needs to be done there. And so I hope I gave you a little sample of what we've been focused on, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Okay, at this time, I don't see any questions.
Well, that wraps things up for the day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you're interested, we did have 120 registrations. I think at the height, maybe in the morning, we had 94 or 96 people on at the same time, probably plus that number plus presenters. So we felt that in terms of people agreeing to do this virtually, that was successful. We truly hope that next year we will all be here in Lafayette. If it means we need to delay the conference a little bit to put it later into the year so that we can do it, you know, in person, we might look at that as a possibility. But thank you again for attending, and hope that you enjoyed the day and got at least a nugget or two out of it. And the topic will be the same again next year, and we'll just be diving deeper into these issues. So thank you again, and see you all soon.